When it comes to evangelism and discipleship, is it possible that Christians need a new mindset? Is it possible that we have been too individualistic in our efforts to share the gospel of Jesus? In this episode of Worldwide Podcast, Navigator International President Mutua Maihiani and International Vice President David Lyons discuss the importance of serving non-believers in teams rather than as lone rangers. As Mutua and David stated, serving together as a community among those who don't know Christ is a profound expression of our triune God. Because the very nature of God is relational, our efforts among non-believers should also be carried out in community, not as individuals. They call us to rethink our approaches to evangelism and discipling. Mutua and David also share a few stories about what serving together among the lost looks like, and they give us practical, joyful ideas for getting started. David and Mutua, my impression is that navigators around the world have long been discipling among those who don't comprehend the gospel of Jesus. These are the people that we sometimes refer to as the lost. But it seems like in recent years, navigators, leaders like both of you, are giving more emphasis to this idea of working together, the idea of taking the gospel not as individuals, but carrying the gospel forward in teams and communities. Do you agree with that assessment? Is there a change going on? And if so, what do you think is causing that change?
I'd like to think, I'd like to say it's the work of the Holy Spirit, that it's not just a tactical shift that we are making. It's not just that we've discovered that working together is more effective, which it is, but that was always God's way. And I remember when we met in Cyprus in 2001 and were processing together and towards what became the core. We reflected together on our previous value, which was the importance of every individual, which I think most of us as navigators, when we come around the navigators, that was a big thing, and it was everywhere. And it drew us a particular kind of person who is entrepreneurial, and you see that working with this individual will produce a huge impact around the world. In Cyprus, I still remember the moment when God seemed to say to us, there is a difference between an individual and a person. And when you take a person as an individual and pull them out of their context relationally, you really don't get to know them well. And you also cut out the influence that they can have through their relational network. So now we talk about our sixth core value of the navigators, which is the dignity and value of every person. So there's been a shift that I think is a God thing, that God helped us to see that even in the scriptures, he spoke to his people as a people. He does speak to us as individuals, but so many of the promises that we claim were actually given in the context of a community.
Yeah, I would agree that there are some cultural forces at work. The Navigators was originally, way back when, birthed in an American context. And some of that American cultural DNA continues to affect aspects of navigators around the world. And I think that two of the fundamental core cultural values of Americans are freedom and independence. And that's affected us and shapes us, even though we've become a very diverse group. That still shapes some of our thinking. And I like to talk about the missing word in our calling statement. It's the word together, that we're called to make disciples. We're called to live and disciple together among the lost, not just live and disciple among the lost. I think that's a good corrective for us at this time.
Well, I think that we know there are these cultural influences, but we as believers also look to the scriptures as something that transcends culture. And so, as you both have looked at the scriptures on this topic, the idea of working together among the lost, as David put it, why do you think, through the lens of the scriptures, why do you think that this is so important as we try to move forward? Why is it so important through the lens of the scriptures to work together in teams?
Sure, David has. Well, let me just say that part of the reason why I wanted David to be with us in this conversation is that he's done a lot of study on this area and has been urging our team to think biblically about this. And when we go to the scriptures, your question is a very good one. What do we find? And I'd like to say that for me, looking, for example, we like the story of Lydia's conversion in Philippi and how Paul and Silas soon after that experienced this miraculous deliverance from prison in that city. But the fact is that Paul's ministry in Philippi was cut short after a few days. He was in Thessalonica for just a few weeks before he was forced to leave. He's in Corinth for 18 months and in Ephesus for 3 years. So it's not really very long periods of time, although he did stay, especially in those, both in Corinth and in Ephesus, a bit longer. But now you fast forward and we come to find 10 years later, you come back to these places and you find that there are growing communities of laborers and the gospel was continuing to advance. For me, it's the fact that there were you see communities there. What was the secret? And although Paul would have liked to stay in these places longer, I think the secret goes back to the fact that even when he was working there, while he was there, he wanted the local believers to carry the gospel into their own people group. So working with them as a community that would speak to a watching world. So for example, he wrote to the Philippians and he said, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then whether I come to see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, contending as one man for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. So Paul had this very clear vision for local laborers living a kingdom lifestyle together. And that the way they related to one another had everything to do with the advance of the gospel, because people are watching this community, and that commends the gospel to the people who surround them. So it was not just the individual evangelists doing their work, which they must do, but there was a community that needed to speak in a way that others could listen. And if they didn't demonstrate kingdom living, he felt that his work would have been in vain. I think the Greek word he uses is kenos, empty. It was kind of like, all I've done is in vain. If the work I've done cannot be seen through the way that you live the gospel in this watching world.
David, what would you add?
I think that the roots of this go way back, even into the very nature of God, our triune God. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they do everything together. They're communal. There's a community in the Trinity, the divine dance of the Trinity, and our lives are supposed to reflect that collective community nature of God. And sometimes we miss that in the English translation of the New Testament. The pronoun you can mean, for us, one person, or can mean a group. But in Greek, it's clear whether it's a group or an individual. So many of the times in the New Testament where there are commands or instructions or descriptions, it's being addressed to a group, not just to an individual. And so we miss the collective communal nature of so much of what's going on in the New Testament when we read it in English. But it's not hard for us to see that, you know, Jesus himself, he poured himself into leaving behind a community of 12 and a bigger community beyond that. You know, he poured himself into a group and left behind a group. And he sent them out, you know, 2 by 2. It was a collective communal assignment for them. And then you look at the Apostle Paul and others, but particularly the Apostle Paul, it just seemed like he never did anything alone. And we missed that. Even the letters he wrote were usually written by a team. You know, he would, oh, here's these other guys, you know, with me. We all greet you, you know. And wherever he went, it seemed like there were people with him. And when he went to Ephesus, you know, when he started the school of Tyrannus, he was working with a group together and equipping them together as a local laboring community that impacted the whole area. And then later, you know, his last time in Ephesus, he called together the local leaders and poured out his heart to them as he had been doing all along. He was determined to leave behind groups of believers and groups of local laborers who were living and discipling together among the lost.
David, you mentioned at the beginning that this is kind of an extension of the Trinity, of God's nature himself. And maybe both of you could just elaborate a little more. Both of you talked about the importance of being together, of relationship as an expression of that carries the gospel forward. Maybe just from your own hearts and minds, what is it that's so powerful about that design?
Well, Jesus famously said, you know, that they'll know you're my disciples by your love for one another. And that's what's really going to set you apart. And the disciples, they had trouble getting along with one another. They had plenty of conflict. But he said, you know, it's not going to be like the world here, not so among you. We're actually going to work through our conflicts so that we're demonstrating real unity. And that's what's going to set us apart. And that's what the world, unfortunately, in our country, in America, you know, that's where we're failing as Christians. They're not seeing that among us. But where they do see that among us, it's a beautiful attraction to who God is and how he wants to express himself in the world.
Yes, and I would add that even in the Old Testament, the reason why God wanted his people to be united was because he had purposes that he was fulfilling. I remember stumbling on Zechariah 10, verses 4 and 5. Many years ago, I had been praying about a leadership responsibility that I had been asked to take. And God led me to this passage. And it says, from Judah will come the cornerstone, from him the tent peg, from him the battle bow, from him every ruler. And then it says, together they will be like mighty men, trampling the muddy streets in battle. Because the Lord is with them, they will fight and overthrow the horsemen. And it's basically saying that it's much more than the sum total of the contributions of the individuals involved. That together they will be like mighty men. They can do much more together than if you added all their contributions together. And that has been a recurring theme for me in my leadership that the Lord has brought back to me time and time again. And the fact that the way that he has given his gift, the distributed gifts within the body, when all of that starts to come together, the impact has huge spiritual significance that goes beyond the sum total of our contributions. And then I was reflecting on Jesus' own desire for his disciples when he was leaving in John 17:11. And he prays for them, John 17:11. And he says, I will remain in the world no longer, but they are still in the world, and I am coming to you. Holy Father, protect them by the power of your name, the name you gave me. And then he says, all of this so that, which is significant, why all this? He said, so that they may be one as we are one. So Jesus is looking for that unity. It's not just a tactical or strategic way of getting the job done. It's actually because the very nature of God, we are one, and I want them to be one, and that's how glory goes back to God. So even if we didn't think that this thing working together is a good idea, the very nature of our God, of our triune God, as David said, forces us to realize that this is not an optional extra. It is the way God works, and he's looking for that within his body. And as the gospel advances, it advances as people watch and they think, they begin to see God at work. The nature of God is manifested through that unity and learning to work together also.
Let's move a little bit from the concept of ministering in teams, kind of the theology that we've talked about. And I'd like to ask you a little bit, what does this look like in our worldwide partnership today? We're in roughly 112 countries, multiple cultures. So I know this might be hard to answer in one specific way, but in your opinion, what does this look like for navigators in their local contexts? What does it look like for people to work together in teams locally? David, why don't you start?
That's such a crucial and strategic question for us. That about a year ago, actually, our team, International Executive Team, and the regional directors sat down together with that very question and asked ourselves, what's it really need to look like for navigators in their local contexts to live out our calling effectively? And God gave us real consensus around a handful of things that need to be there for this to really work and for the navigator calling to flow in our local contexts. And our responses really fell together around two words, and that is together and among. Together and among. And by together, and we had some specific things in mind, we need to be together in one shared purpose of what we're looking to God to do in that context. There needs to be intentional local leadership. That's very crucial. We need to be doing life together. So not just meeting and doing a Bible study together, or even just meeting and praying, but we're actually doing life together in our context. And that group that's coming together is really our primary place of belonging. We can have multiple places of belonging. We all have multiple loyalties, and that's good. But that this group is really our primary place of belonging. And that's where we're doing life together. And that the group is actually transformational, that we are experiencing transformation ourselves, and we're bringing transformation to our environment. So that's what we mean by together. But then the among part has its own special challenges, that we need to be really pursuing ministry in our natural habitat. Not just going off to some base, which is great, or going off to a campus, which is wonderful, or some other target, but in our natural habitat where we work, live, and play.
Uta, what's your take on that?
So there is a connection there, that we don't just do discipling and then do evangelism. It's one. It all ties together. I was thinking about an experience we had when I was living in Nairobi, when we were living in Nairobi, and my wife and I were feeling that we were not being very effective in our neighborhood. We were not reaching others very well. We didn't have much courage, and God put us together with others in our Navigator staff group, and we started sharing with one another about our burden to see more happen. And it was surprising how much more courage each member of that group showed when they started to, to share their journey. And so we were celebrating small victories together. And that gave us the courage to believe in for more. Our team here in Colorado Springs, the IET, we've been talking about how we can experience more of this being together among the lost, because it's very easy for Navigator leaders to be flying all over the world when COVID is not stopping them, to be flying all over the world, but in their local context, to not really be having much of an impact. And we recognize that we need one another, and the teams we are on can actually be and probably should pray about becoming more missional communities.
David, I like the phrase you used, be active in your natural habitat, and doing that together with other people. Are there some examples that you have seen either in the U.S. or around the world? One or two examples that maybe you could share, and what is, describe that for us. What does it look like?
Yeah, one beautiful example is taking place in the Middle East now. It's in a very distressed area of the Middle East, and one of our key people there started a little sandwich shop, and some of his key guys, he's hired some of his key guys, and they are serving the community, serving them sandwiches, and they sit down with their customers and they're sharing their life, and before you know it, they're having discussions around who Jesus is or different truths from the Bible. And it's just happening as they go in the midst of their business. And actually all over that region, that's a lot of where our Navigator work is taking place, is in the midst of businesses, missional enterprises, where people are just doing life together and their customers are doing life with them, and they're seeing Christ and coming to Christ in that context. But like neighborhoods, I mean, for just ourselves, Renee and I in our neighborhood, we've been there 16 years now. And when we first moved there, it was just a gift from God. There was a family, we didn't know when we moved there, there's a family diagonally across the street from them. We have 7 kids, they have 7 kids, and we just bonded, and they're deep in Christ. And so over the years, all the children from the neighborhood ended up in our 2 homes, and we were just constantly doing parties together, and one by one, people were coming to Christ, and it was a beautiful, fruitful thing over a number of years. Then they moved, they didn't move away, but they took a place up in the mountains, and they're hardly around anymore. Well, Renee and I feel like, we're walking on one leg without having them with us. So we're praying for another couple to partner with us, because we need that together. So we've seen the fruitfulness of it, and we're feeling the need for it now.
I love the simplicity of what David is describing. It makes it so doable. It sounds so doable when you hear about the steps involved. It's nothing that the average person cannot do. And that the beauty of it is that God has given the gifts needed to his body. And when we start seeing those come together, one person will become the connector, another will just love to host. And when all that comes together, the impact is it's not just a big talk about the strong evangelist, but together we can have an impact in where God has placed us.
I'm going to push you guys a little bit here, if you don't mind, because this approach to ministry is highly relational. It's as Muta was describing, Christians need to represent a set of relationships that are healthy and beautiful to the people who are looking in on that. But if we're honest, I think relationships can be tough. A lot of times our kids are disobedient, and we have tension between husband and wife, or relationships aren't just smooth and easy in reality. So, as we try to come together as a group to influence the lost, I mean, does this mean we have to be perfect?
Yeah, for us in our neighborhood, the big breakthroughs came when we were the most broken. Uh, we'd been there for a while, and then, our son Ian, he was loved and known all over the neighborhood, and then he got cancer. And our neighbor across the street from another country, the first time I met her, I identified with Christ, and she physically recoiled. She was so appalled that there's a Christian across the street. And yet, when we got the news about Ian, she was the first one at our door. Renee collapsed into her arms in tears. She walked with us, and she got to see what it's like when Christians suffer. And, when Ian died, she didn't eat for 2 weeks after that. She suffered with us. And she's not even in Christ yet, But after that, she began to open up. She saw our brokenness. She walked with us through our brokenness. And then she started reading the scriptures. And just a couple weeks ago, now that's 10 years ago, but a couple weeks ago, her son, Ian's closest friend in the neighborhood, was in a motorcycle accident. And we got to walk with her. We're standing in the middle of the street, crying with her, laying hands on her, praying for her. And she's praying. I mean, it's in our midst of our brokenness that we go deep and we really get to know the real person.
But David, has it been hard for you to be vulnerable in those moments? Our tendency, well, I'll let you talk, but it seems like our tendency can be to try to gloss over things and just present a good face.
Yeah. Well, when you're really broken, you can't pretend. And so we kind of got pushed through that barrier, I guess. But there's a temptation to hide our struggles. But I guess we've seen often enough over a long enough period of time that when we're vulnerable and authentic with people, it's more of a magnet. It's actually the greatest magnet, is when people are looking for authenticity. You do not want plastic, fake faith. They want to see something that really works under fire.
Mutu, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, David's story it's so powerful because it's tough times will come, and so opportunities will arise, whether we like it or not. But I thought I'd just emphasize a slightly different aspect of this weakness, which when Paul talks about boasting of his weaknesses so that the power of Christ might rest upon him, we can spiritualize that and think there are certain acceptable weaknesses, but we are broken people. We are dealing with sin in families. We are dealing with people's failure to live up to their expectations. You're dealing with our own shortcomings, and that God is not saying, well, when you get yourself sorted out, come back and maybe you might find some fruit. But that as He is transforming us, He puts us in the context of community, of His body, and sometimes that exposes our weaknesses even more. And as we are learning to say sorry, as we are learning to make room for others into our lives, as God is transforming us, He starts to create something new. But that's a painful time. So I think there is some great liberation in knowing we are not on display. We are not trying to prove anything. We are primarily seeking to walk with God. And as He changes us, He also uses us. The process of transformation is also the process of advancing the gospel. It's not that I'll transform you, then I'll use you. Because then if that was true, and sometimes we say that rather glibly, if that is true, then we would have had to become perfect before He can use us. And we know that God is using broken vessels. So the transformation is actually part of the of the experience of being used by God.
You know, we have thousands of navigators, men and women, who they work long hours in their professions and they're raising kids, and many are college students trying to find their way in their professions. There's a lot of stress and pressures on people today. What are some practical steps that you might recommend for some people, navigators, to take some initial steps to be intentional about forming a community and being intentional together to get out among the lost? What, if I wanted to start that, what would that look like?
You know, some practical things that we're pursuing. One is just prayer walking in the neighborhood. You know, after dinner and many evenings, Renee and I'll just go for a walk. We have a loop. It takes about 10 minutes for us to walk the loop of our neighborhood. And just looking for practical needs. You know, so like there's a widow down around the corner. She has this beautiful garden, but she's getting too old to take care of it. Been trying to rally some of the neighbors. Let's go pull her weeds. Let's go trim her bushes together. And there's another one that needs help fixing his fence. Well, let's do that together, right? Mm-hmm. And so doesn't have to be rocket science, is what I'm saying. Prayer walk your neighborhood, pray for partners, meet practical needs. God does stuff. Mm-hmm. We moved our badminton set out in the front yard by the sidewalk. Within 15 minutes, there were neighbors playing with us.
That's great. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a different mindset. It is just changing our mindset a little bit to think about, think about families a lot of times. How can we draw together as a family, our relatives and our kids, and pool together in this type of an effort and integrate it with an outreach effort to the neighborhood. So,
yes.
Just that if I had the opportunity to sit with a navigator, disciple, or laborer anywhere in the world, I'd just love to put my hand on their shoulder and say, God never intended for you to do this alone. Mm. It intends for you to have kindred spirits to do this together. He's with you, and he intends for the people of God to do this together. He sent his Holy Spirit, and he will send his people to come alongside you. And we as navigators are increasingly determined to be there for you, to help you to flourish in your context, where you live, work, and play for the rest of your life.